Norm, thanks for joining us, man.
Hey, it's an honor to be here with both you guys. I'm a huge fan, so thanks for having me here.
Well, I appreciate it. Yeah, and we just talked for I think over an hour just before we even
I will
record.
do that. So just give me the hook if I go off on a tangent.
No, it's awesome. It's so cool to hear your perspective and what you lived through and the things that you saw. You know, I was in the Navy in the 90s, so you know that we have some overlapping time in service. And as I told Mike Durant, you know, when that was going on in Somalia, I was at SEAL Team 1, and I'm watching as that stuff's going down, and there's nothing you can do. You know, you're sitting back here and there's nothing you can do. But watching it unfold was crazy. And then to sit here with you guys that lived through that it's kind of a very strange thing to have happen, that I literally was watching you guys on the news as a young SEAL, and now here we are sitting here getting a solid debrief on all that, which we'll get to. But before we get there, let's talk about your background. What was growing up like for you?
Yeah, so grew up Texas kid, West Texas. So I was born in Dallas, but very shortly after a couple years, I moved to a little town called Brackettville, Texas, in Kinney County, about 15 miles from the Rio Grande River. My dad took a job on the Anacacho Ranch, which is a big historic ranch down there in that area. And so I spent my first couple years down there on that ranch, kind of free ranging, you know. But my basic rules really before I was in school was, you know, be back before it gets dark and don't play with rattlesnakes, you know. So by the time I was 5 or 6 years old, I was unsupervised with a 22 pump rifle running around shooting cans and snakes and just
no range safety officer.
No range safety officer. I was telling somebody when I was in Special Forces, I was like, man, the Army spends weeks training to do stuff I'd do off the cuff when I was 7 years old, you know. But I was very blessed to grow up out there like that. And then you know, somebody one day whipped me up and said, hey, we're going into town, you're going to school. Mm-hmm. And so it was horrible. I mean, I remember my mom took me in. I wouldn't go into the school. And so she brought me back home, and my dad was like, what the hell's the problem? And he said, he won't go. And my dad took me back in.
So what are you, like 8 years old or 7 years old or something like that?
Yeah, 7 years old in first grade. Yeah.
And you just refused entry.
I wouldn't go in, man. Because I didn't know what it was, and I was so used to doing whatever I wanted to do, which caused me problems for the rest of my life, by the way, and that I just didn't want to be in there, you know, looking at a chalkboard all day. It was brutal. And then my dad finally took me out, and he drugged me down the hallway, pushed me in through the door of the school, and I can still remember my cowboy boots sliding on the floor as he pushed me down the hallway. And then he pushed me into the classroom, and I'll never forget the teacher's name was Miss Veltman. And in a town we grew up in, it was kind of like a little house on the prairie kind of school, you know. And I saw, as he pushed me through the door, I looked, and there was an open window, one of those things you roll up, and I went across the classroom, out the window, and down through the playground and into the woods. And, man, he was furious. But anyway, he took me back into school, and she said, all you got to do is sit here, and there was a big wooden airplane in the corner, and play with that airplane. Mm-hmm. And for the first couple of days, that's all I did, was just push an airplane around in the corner. And then, you know, I had to adapt to it, but I remember asking her, I said, how long do I have to do this? And she says, well, what do you mean? I said, how long do I have to go to school? And she goes, well, you got to go through elementary school, middle school, and then high school, and then you're done. And I said, how long is that? And she goes, 12 years. For a 7-year-old kid, that's 2 life sentences, right? So I was like, oh, my God. And I never fit. Mm-hmm. It was just every day I spent in school was absolutely horrible for me. And I think if I hadn't started out doing whatever the hell I wanted to do, I might have been able to adapt a little better. Mm-hmm. But when you have no rules, and all of a sudden now you did nothing but rules, mm-hmm. It was a difficult transition. But I was glad when it was over. And I made it all the way through, graduated high school. First guy on that side of the family to do that, by the way. So obviously it wasn't just my problem. A lot of them had problems with it. But
you come from a long line of people trying to stay out of school.
Long line of people that didn't like structure. But my dad was a ranch worker, and You know, he for a time he worked on the ranch, and then he took a job as a state tick rider. So he rode the border on horseback, looking for livestock that didn't belong there. So livestock to cross the river, and I used to go ride the river with him when I was a little kid, and and enjoyed that part of living out there in Kenny County. But he also had to make a little money on the side, and one of the things his family did was make bootleg whiskey. So, and along with a lot of other things, and so grew up around that environment. He actually brought that in from my grandmother's side of the family, who came in, back in the 1840s from Texas.
Just
to Texas.
Straight up old school bootleggers.
Yeah, they would make it, and they weren't popcorn Sutton or anything like that. They didn't make huge amounts of it, but they made enough to put gas in the truck, and enough for friends and family to have a little bit of moonshine laying around the house when they want it. But which caused me a little issue later on in life. But yeah, he was and in and out of jail. Man, that's the if you want to talk about my childhood, that's what I remember most about it.
What was he getting rolled up for?
Everything from bootleg whiskey to barroom brawling to homicide. He went to jail for a homicide, and when I was about 10, and I didn't see him for a few years there. He was never convicted of a felony. He beat it, but we just couldn't bond him out. So he was in, and I'm doing this off memory best I can as a kid, but he was in Meridian, Mississippi, and something to do related with probably bootleg whiskey, and he killed 2 guys in a parking lot. And I remember when I was a little kid, the sheriff came to the house and told my mother, and I remember her dropping down to her knees and crying because what do you do? But that was kind of the story of his life. I mean, if it wasn't that, he was down in Laredo, Texas, getting in a knife fight or something. I can remember early on, seeing that violence in that side of the family, and the violence doesn't scare me because I got used to seeing it, but the consequences do, because I know what it did to my family, my sisters and me. But that's just the way they handle things. I remember, when I was in first grade, again, hating school, I can remember the first time I got my ass kicked in school. I was a first grader and got in a fight with a kid named Jesse Cannon, and he was a big, tough kid, and got punched in the nose. That's the first time I ever got, I think, knocked out. I definitely got knocked down, and all I saw was stars, and the nose was bleeding, mouth was bleeding, and I went home crying, And my mom met me at the front door. She said, "Oh my God, what happened? What happened?" And my dad was in the bathroom, sitting on the toilet, and he said, "Shut up and get your ass in here." And he said, "What's going on?" And I said, "Jesse punched me in the nose." And he goes, "Whose fault is that?" I said, "It's Jesse's fault." And he goes, "No." He goes, "That's your fault. Move your nose next time." Right? So you're accountable for it, right? So, and then he gave me a spanking for crying. And the next day, he had a ball bat in the back of his truck. It was sawed in half, and it had a lanyard on it. And he said, "Take this to school with you today and take care of business." And I was like, 6-year-old, 7-year-old kid. I was like, this is serious. So I went to school. I didn't do it. And I came back home, and he goes, did you do what I told you to do? And I said, "No, sir." And he goes, "Why?" And I was like, "I don't want to hurt him." And he said, "Then you got no business fighting." He goes, "And don't come home crying about it again."